Good morning, everyone. We are live now on Facebook. This is Office Hours, our study of the Book of Ruth, week number 2. My name is Chris Holmes. I am the Stembler Scholar in Residence at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta, and thrilled to be joined this morning by two great friends of Bible study. Brennan, will you go ahead and introduce yourself and then introduce our distinguished guest?
Thanks. My name is Brennan Breed, and I'm Associate Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Seminary, and I'm a theologian in residence at First Presbyterian Church of Marietta, and I am overjoyed to be welcoming here the William McFeeters, Emerita Professor of Old Testament from Columbia Theological Seminary, author of many excellent books. I'm gonna give you there's some time here to explain some of the new books that have come out. But I'm gonna give the name of my favorite, a great book that came before the last two books that she just wrote from our prolific guest. But as a Jeremiah and the Tears of the World, beautiful book which changed the way that I read the Bible and is just a beautiful reflection on trauma and the ways that we can learn from how the Bible tells us and teaches us to think and deal with traumatic events, but also about Jeremiah himself as a prophet and his prophecies. So a book that we assign pieces of every year, but also the author of two new books, a new 2-volume commentary on Genesis, which we will hear a little bit about in a minute. But please welcome Kathleen O'Connor. And Kathleen, we always begin by asking our guests a little something. Just kind of give us a little tip about how you tend to read the Bible or how you tend to approach the Bible. So are there any presuppositions, like hermeneutical, theological presuppositions that guide your reading? And thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you. I can just say quickly that my acquaintance with Chris Holmes was mostly in airports coming back from Louisville, talking about the sublime. And I'm delighted to have been the predecessor for Brennan Breed, who has not only succeeded me at Columbia Seminary, but has replaced me in amazing ways. So thank you.
Oh, no, that can't happen.
Thank you. Okay, how do I go about reading biblical text? That's been a transformation throughout my long career, my fairly long career as a Bible scholar. And when I started, it was all source criticism, taking the text apart, which came from where. I hated it. I didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. I still hate it. I know we need it. I know it's important. But what I was always interested in were two things: the story or the poetry itself, the literary shape of a text, and its theological possibilities. It's what it contributes to living now in the world in conversation with biblical text. And now, I think I want to go a little deeper and say that what I'm really interested in is the literature in its historical context. But I add one more thing. I want to guess or figure or speculate about how that literature functions in that historical context. Because I don't think a text is just there to give us a history. I think it's there to intervene in history. I think it's there to shape the community to whom the editors, the authors are writing or presenting this material. So, and of course, you can't prove any of this. It's speculation on, and I hope it's educated guesses, but I say that right off the bat. Educated guesses.
Someone you know very well, Carol Newsom. Yes. I was also interested in the function of text, what texts do to people.
Yes.
And she, in my dissertation defense, asked a question: Chris, how do you go about measuring this function or the effect of a text? Do you have little sensors that you can tell? And it was like, fair point. We can only sort of gesture towards what we think the function would be based on certain rules or certain things, but we can't for sure know that this would do this or that would do that.
Right. But you can get an accumulation of connections that suggest. Right. And then you say it with absolute authority, and sometimes people believe you.
Yeah.
That's the key.
It's all about confidence.
Well, so Kathleen, can you tell us a little bit about your Genesis commentaries?
Oh, nothing. I'd like to do more, to tell you the truth. So that's actually what's helped me think more and more about the function of texts, because what I have to say that I arrived at the study of Genesis, which I'd put aside after I was working on the book of Jeremiah. And when I was studying Jeremiah, I came upon trauma theory, which I call trauma and disaster theory, to distinguish it from PTSD and individualized trauma. And I began to see the whole book of Jeremiah as a response to the collective disaster of the Babylonian invasion of Judah, Jerusalem. And so then I finished that book, and then I turned to Genesis, and I'm moving along. I get up to chapter 6, to the flood story, and I dread those chapter 6 to chapter 9. I dread them because how can you do that without doing source criticism, which I've already announced that I don't really like to do. And I thought, this is really, should I even be doing this? And then, though, in addition to the sources, I began to see the flood narrative as this colossal cosmic disaster. And that helped me go back to what I was seeing in Jeremiah about the way the texts might be functioning as survival literature, as texts that help an audience see its own suffering so they can come to terms with it. But they come to terms with it after a long period, and maybe it's best to say they have to do it from a distance, because if you take them back into if you take people who've experienced trauma back into the literal violence of assault, of warfare, of displacement, the danger is to re-traumatize and keep the violence and the chaos continually going in a loop. So I saw then that every chapter in Genesis, I know we're not talking about Genesis, but every chapter in Genesis is a catastrophe story. Every single ancestor, every bit of the primal narratives up chapters 1 to 12, they're all about what looks like the end of somebody's life or of the whole people's life. But always, 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 there are survivors. So that led me into Genesis, and it's been the most fun because I'm always discovering something, or inventing it. Perhaps I'm inventing it. Which way?
Well, I have really loved the first volume. The second volume I know is not quite out yet, but I have seen an advanced copy, and let me tell you, I have loved reading through it. It's
Thank
so
you.
much so that it convinced me to pick up an introductory Hebrew textbook that focuses on the Joseph story for learning. Yeah, it's like a Kutz and Joesberger. It's a very new, just came out last year, but the workbook focuses on translating the Joseph story. So you get a little bit of it every week in kind of a graded reader. So it's edited so they can read it. But the idea is that's such a well-written story that it's, and there's so much to learn from it that it works as a kind of a graded reader. But anyway, I'm going to be dropping little hints from your commentary throughout. I hope you don't mind. But in any event, I thank you so much for that. But also your work on Genesis and your work on trauma, kind of collective trauma, but also the catastrophes that happen in each chapter, that seems to connect pretty closely to the book of Ruth, which opens and continues with catastrophes throughout. So, I mean, do you want to just, it's okay to spill the beans. We've all read Ruth 1. So we don't need to hold our cards tight. But yes, what do you see that connects this is catastrophe literature, right?
It's catastrophe literature. It's survival literature. It's gentle survival literature. And the catastrophe is primarily in the beginning of the book, right here in chapter 1, but it's not making an effort to go do re-entry into trauma so much as to say this has happened to these women. And so catastrophes are immigration, or is it emigration or immigration? I get them mixed up, where they go to Moab. So they're already displaced people. They're like the exiles in Persia, in Babylon, and then later Persia. Then they lose all the men in the family. And I know you have a question about that. And it's really, the women are all widows. And it's different than being a widow in contemporary America, though there are similarities, of course. There's an economic reality about widowhood in the ancient world, because the assumption is a woman is to be supported by her husband and household. And if he dies and she has no sons, not just daughters, but no sons, then her possibilities are to return to her family, which may or may not be able to sustain her return or want her to return, or she can become a day laborer, which we see happening here in Ruth, or maybe she could become a prostitute to support herself. She's really at the mercy of the society. And the book of Amos talks about orphans, widows, and the poor in the same sense. So it begins with precarity. I don't like that word. It begins with such precarious circumstances.
Yeah.
So then, of course, two women return by themselves. I mean, that's the next problem. Women traveling alone and returning. And since I think you asked about connection to Genesis, since I think the book of Genesis has an intention of encouraging return to the land and encouraging reconstitution of the nation in the land, I see this echoed here, even with the Hebrew word shuv, for those out there who might be doing Hebrew, learning Hebrew, and they aren't, they should be.
Yes, that's right.
I think that that this text is presenting us with the same reality. And there's one more thing that's strong, and that is the fact that Ruth is the foreign woman, which is another subtext in Genesis, and especially in the Joseph story. Well, it starts with Tamar, but it even goes back. It goes back earlier, where some of the men in the family are marrying foreign women, like Esau is cast out because he marries. His parents don't like him because he's marrying foreign women. But then you get to Tamar in the Joseph story, and she's a foreign woman. She's a Canaanite woman who saves Judah and the line of Judah. And then you go further on, and Joseph marries an Egyptian woman, has two sons who are Egyptian, and they are incorporated into the whole nation by their father. I think I'm saying too much here, but
no, it's good.
Jacob's adoption of Joseph's two sons at the same level of generation as the 12 brothers who are the tribal group. It does mess up tribal relationships, but it's a clear declaration that foreign-born wives and children belong in Israel. There's even a genealogy. Okay, that's the end of Genesis. But I think that's what's exactly going on here. Since we have Ruth in chapter 1, she's called Ruth when they're just in Moab. But at the end of the chapter, the text starts calling her Ruth the Moabitess. Ruth the Moabite.
Mm-hmm.
And she gets called that I didn't count, every single time after that. And so here we have the foreign woman who comes among them. And even Naomi, her mother-in-law, isn't sure about bringing her back. And we have to wonder why.
Mm-hmm.
We have to wonder why she won't bring her two daughters-in-law back with her.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question about Naomi's emotions, which we can see really at the end of the chapter come out too. But that's great. Thank you for situating that. So one of the things we talked about last week was that the Book of Ruth, Elaine James was helping us think about the Book of Ruth really as a novella, like a little novel, and how it's structured so well. And so at the end, when we hear about the narratives that connect to Genesis and all these names that start dropping, but those are kind of hidden until the end, right? So these deep connections to Genesis are kind of they're not exact. They're on the surface, but they're kind of literary connections and thematic connections. But then at the end, you see this kind of enormous connection to like the history of Israel, including the stories of Genesis and David and so on. So so much of the book is if you just start talking about little bits of it, then you have to kind of bring in all these other parts to connect. In part because it's so well plotted and compact and everything.
Yes.
But these first few verses pack in. This is like our for if you're writing a novel, this is our what do you call that? You're setting the stage, our exposition here. But so it's done, I think, really artfully. Yeah. So how do these first couple of verses set things up?
I love them. Okay, so I said to both of you before that Mark Twain told us that to a person with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I'm a person with trauma theory, and so that's what I'm seeing. And so I wonder, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So here we have disaster and trauma. And Brennan, you asked the question about why the days of the judges.
Yeah.
And I haven't any idea, but I have two guesses. One is because the way I think survival literature works is not to hit you too directly in the face with something that has just happened to you or your people. I suggest this about the ancestors in Genesis, that you talk about people from the past, the ancestors. So you set it back, you set it at another time. And so you can see that people have survived this from the past. And I think that's good. But I also think that the Judges is a time of chaos, the period of Judges, which, would you all agree with that? I mean, do you think that's true?
Yeah. And a time that's kind of associated biblically with women being treated especially poorly as the book of Judges goes on.
Especially Judges 19. Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah, this kind of devolution of, that was the older version of the Women's Bible Commentary had I thought a really great chapter by Susan Niditch on kind of the health of Israel being kind of followed by the treatment of women and how it fell over the course of the period of the Judges, and ending up with this horrific story. So in this kind of traumatic situation, then especially that is kind of thematized by these traumatic stories that happen, especially to women. In the middle of that, we get this famine, right? And so, what role does famine play? I mean, that's another connection to Genesis too.
Another connection to Genesis.
Yeah.
Especially the Joseph story, but it happens under Abraham, and it happens again. When does it happen again? Isaac, I guess. I don't remember.
Yeah.
I think but there's three references, and of course the Joseph story, which I kind of think is set right at the point of Persian possibility allowing people to return, and should they return, and if they return, will they get along? Will they be able to? Does the nation of Judah, Israel survive? Is that question. Well, here I think we're being deliberately invited to revisit this. Now, I want to add to that I think that the theme of famine is a theme of catastrophe.
Yeah.
As we just need to look around the globe right now, and we see without food, people cannot survive as people. And so the fact that there is a famine in the land of Judah and Israel, and Elimelech goes there to survive, that we're already in a survival situation, because in Moab, by the way, I notice, in Moab, there's food. There's a possibility. It looks like they're all immigrant laborers, does it not? Because it's interesting to me that the Hebrew says the fields of Moab, and the land of Israel. It's Eretz, for those who care. So that you could say, it would be easy to say that they're working in fields, just because that little choice of word there. So land, it's not nation of Moab.
Yeah.
It's not Eretz. It's land in a different sense. It means that, but So that's a nuance. And so we have another element of catastrophe.
And Elaine pointed out that field occurs so much in the rest of the book, chapters 2 and 3 and 4, and field is used even in places where other places in the Hebrew Bible you wouldn't necessarily see field used that way so often.
Right.
But so that's suggesting that this kind of a tie to the land and agricultural production and food is so important. But also the name Ruth, right, which means kind of someone who's full. That this kind of like this theme. And there's also the name of the town that's mentioned here, right? Why Bethlehem?
Oh, yeah, of course. Bethlehem, the house of bread. And it's so you already have the contrast, or let's call it the foreshadowing, right there at the beginning of the story. We also have another, you asked this question to me in our preparation for this, but we also have other names that are significant.
Oh yeah, please. Yeah. Because they're all in the first couple of verses.
The men's names, which we don't talk about very often. One of them means weakness, and the other means sickness.
Yeah. Oh, Mahlon and Kilian, poor guys. Yeah. What was Naomi doing naming them? Yeah. Something that just struck me about the names too is that, Ruth means fullness, or it can mean fullness. Mara, and Naomi's name is like sweetness, and then like Mara kind of is like bitterness. I mean, there's so much about like kind of taste in this too that just kind of popped in my head. But in any event, but Mahlon and Kilian, poor guys. Yeah, just sickness and waste or something.
Well, I mean, it's as if another aspect of the collapse or the failure of Israel to survive, the inability to survive, is not related to the women so much. In typical cultural realities, it's related to the men, and these men are sick and weak, and then they die, I guess, and that leaves us with one woman whom I call pleasantness, sweet, pleasant. But I thought Ruth also meant friendship.
I think it can, yeah. It's companionship, friendship. But yeah, also I think it depends on which subroot you're pulling it from.
We will not argue about that because I don't have a clue.
But it is, that idea that is it is so important to see like this kind of family structure built, and then you get these, and that connects to the Judges as well. This time of kind of sick and weak men. And Elimelech, my father is king. There's other Melech names in the Judges that end up pretty poorly. When Gideon goes kind of crazy, and Abimelech is his son, and there's this fight over him trying to become king, or maybe whatever. But there's all sorts of stuff about power in the Book of Judges, and how the men are chasing this power that really corrupts them, and that has all these impacts on women in their lives. I've never noticed that before. That's really fascinating.
We could be giving good sermons right now if we wanted to, but we won't.
There you go. Yeah. We're getting good fodder out there.
I do think, Kathleen, as you're talking, there is, and it's so subtle and it's so gentle, but there is something very subversive about the way that this story sets it up. That these men are weak and dead and dying. These women who really have no hope but to attach themselves with a male heir, somehow find agency, somehow find power to move back, that they do. It just strikes me, even the line later in chapter 1 where Naomi says to her daughters, "Go back to your mother's household," struck me as, wouldn't it normally be the father's household? Isn't it significant that again, in a subtle and very nuanced way, that we're bringing up into the spotlight people that maybe wouldn't normally be spotlighted in this culture.
Absolutely. That language, go back to your mother's house, it really stops the eye immediately. The other place that I know it occurs is in Song of Songs, and there might be one or two other places. And the Song of Songs is in some ways largely a woman's set of poems and lyrics about sexuality and love. Not completely, but largely. And so they're also going to your mother's house. But I wonder if they're sent back to their mother's house because their fathers and brothers have died. I don't understand. I just don't have a clue to how to answer that. But it's one more element of precariousness in their lives here.
Yeah, that's right.
Back to their mother. Right. So one goes back. Brennan, does the word Orpah, the name Orpah, does that mean neck?
Yeah, kind of back of the neck, like this kind of back of the neck area. Yeah, like she turns around and gives her neck back to Naomi when she turns around and goes home, which seems to be the right thing for her to do, right? I mean, I think one of the things that is that this story's been told so often, and especially Christian readers have heard this so much that it just kind of seems like this is the way it has to happen. But one of the things that I think is really important is to realize how unusual and how strange some of these decisions that they're making. I mean, like even the idea to go sojourn in a foreign land, it's a typical thing, but it's also would have been so dangerous. And you point out precariousness and vulnerability. If you go to a sojourn, be a ger in Hebrew, as it says in Ruth 1:1, to a foreign land, especially Moab, which, is friends with Israel sometimes, is enemies with Israel other times. Right, so you're always so vulnerable. Like there's not much water in the ancient Near East. There's not many resources. Food is scarce always, and so you're going to this other place and kind of throwing yourself at their mercy. And they seem to have made a go of it for a while there, which suggests that Moab actually kind of took care of them, took them in, and these Ruth and Orpah come from. So like there was some intermarriage, which is condemned at parts in the Bible, but also happens a lot in the Bible. But so it seems like they kind of threw themselves at the mercy of Moab, and Moab actually, for a time, did support them, or at least welcomed them. And now the question is, are we going to be as welcoming as Moab was, right?
You mean us now? Is that what you mean? Well,
that's one question. But also, the author is telling the story really from the perspective of kind of ancient Israel. It ends with David. So the question is, when the foreigner comes here, what do we do? And would we intermarry? Would we welcome them? Would we, would they find bread here if they came? And it seems, that's a big question.
But then that goes on when they return, whether or not they're going to receive Ruth. And the fact that Naomi doesn't say anything when Ruth says she's going to cling to, when Ruth clings to her and won't go home, she disobeys her mother-in-law, and that probably wasn't what you're supposed to do.
Yes.
And so she goes with her, and Naomi says nothing. And you think, well, this woman's going to accompany you. You should be grateful. Show some kindness. And she doesn't. And she's just silent. But she might be thinking about Ruth's own safety, going back to Bethlehem, to the house of bread, where her community is, and may or may not want Ruth. Moose now. Ruth, the Moabite, they might want her with them.
Yeah, and it may reflect badly on Naomi too, to bring this kind of foreigner, So there may be a bunch of mixed emotions and
right.
And Naomi, at some level, takes on responsibility for caring for Ruth, at least in terms of again, I think it's easy for us to read like, oh, this is a younger daughter or daughter-in-law taking care of her, aging mother-in-law. But the sort of economics that you highlighted before would suggest maybe, no, Naomi now is taking on a responsibility to protect or to provide, and that there's a burden there. So we could see why Ruth's act of, we can call it solidarity. Some interpreters call it solidarity, right? But it's also disobedience, as you pointed out, and it's putting Naomi potentially in an even more problematic situation.
It is.
Because she's now traveling back to her home country with a foreign woman. And this just came to me, and if this question isn't immediately answerable, we can just move on. But I'm wondering about like how a woman whose husband and two sons have died would be perceived by the people in Bethlehem. Is this like, a cursed woman walking into town, and the sort of association is, what did she do to piss off whatever God she serves? Or, would there be any of that sort of connotation that her history even would be problematic or potentially threatening to, the good old folks in Bethlehem?
Right. Well, so I think you're onto something there, because part of the mark against them is they left town. They left Bethlehem and went to Moab.
Right.
Now they've survived. They've come back. She's come back, and she doesn't know how she's going to be received. And she already determines to the a community that gathers around her, how she should be perceived. Her name should not be pleasantness and sweetness anymore. Her name should be bitterness, Mara, Mary. The word Mary, the name Mary comes from that. So she should, so she's a depressive person at the beginning of this story. She has no energy. She has identified her reality as a really negative place. She doesn't have much hope for anything. And so poor Ruth, who's signed up to go with her, is now not only going into new territory, she's also now with a woman who is in great need of psychological assistance and mental health issues.
And so yeah, we've got the precariousness on all sides. And what would have been precarious for Ruth in particular as a Moabite woman coming into Israel? We mentioned there are some fraught connections there, but what would have been the perception, you think, or at least what, like in the world of the story, what seems to be some of the assumptions about the identity of a Moabite woman coming to sojourn in Israel?
Well, she's the foreign woman from an enemy nation. So she's from, well, I won't take any from today. She's from a faraway country, and she's possibly an enemy because the Moabite, because the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, tells us many times that Moabites are not even allowed into the assembly of worshipers because they're bad enemies. So she comes in with a frame of, people have a frame of reference about her nation, potentially, and so they don't want her, presumably. And she may worship other gods and be a danger to the worship of Yahweh, of Adonai. And so she's probably shunned, but maybe she's not even noticed. That would be another way to think about it, because women really weren't important.
So yeah, I kind of added that.
And there would also be, I mean, there's also in the fact that Bethlehem and Judah experienced this famine some years before. And so even if there is now bread, you know, she hears that there's bread in Bethlehem, so she's going to return. It's probably likely that the people of Bethlehem are still, you know, a little worried about if there's going to be enough. Is this a scarcity mentality? And we've got this this outsider who's gonna, you know, now be a part of our, you know, our food system, and are we gonna have enough to provide for a foreigner?
Well, so I like to think about why they didn't just stay in Moab. And if we speculate about that, we can say, well, they don't really have family there. They have no sons. They apparently have no daughters either. They are on their own, and maybe they're not going to survive in Moab, and they have to return. But I also think that this is about inviting the ancient audience of the text to be sure to return, or if they have returned, they walk into a place that is now coming back to life at the house of bread, Bethlehem, and they have the potential for survival there. And so, I mean, I think we have foreshadowings of what's going to happen in the future, but whether or not survivor is going to happen is still a pressing question. But for the audience that I'm imagining, that I keep returning to, that are in Persia, that are coming back, they're coming back with their foreign wives. So here is not a husband with a foreign wife. Here is a mother-in-law with a foreign daughter-in-law. And so I think that the real issue in the book is, can this nation, this reconstituting nation, include all the people that are coming to it who are married to the family? And I just to give off to give off the ending, she not only meets qualifications of being a good daughter-in-law, she saves the nation. She saves the nation by giving birth. And so so that then it becomes rhetoric. This is a book of rhetoric if I'm even remotely right, this is a book of rhetoric to try to get the people to be inclusive of the foreign wives and children. That
and your suggestion is almost highlights the tension then that a book of Ruth would have with like an Ezra Nehemiah account, even
Yes.
stronger than maybe some interpreters would want to say that there's less dissonance. Your sort of persuasive reading of Ruth is this is a counter text to the perspective of Ezra and Nehemiah, which is also about, what's the best way forward for a reconstituted nation? What's the best way forward for our worth together? And they say, get rid of all foreignness.
Right.
And explicitly Moabite women in Ezra and Nehemiah, right? I mean, in Nehemiah 13, right, they're looking through the law and they're like, whoa, it says in Deuteronomy that no Ammonite or Moabite women are allowed in the assembly. And so then they go to try to kick out all these foreign wives and the children, right? This kind of ethnic cleansing in a way. But so in any event, you can, Moabiteness is even like such a particularly fraught identity there. I mean, even if there would have been any Moabite people there, they would have been like the symbol for these bad women, right? That are temptresses. Right.
Well, add to that that the women, that the names of people, I mean, for people who want to put it back in the period of Judges as an historical reality, I mean, just the fact that these people have names that are symbolic names suggests right off the bat we're dealing with a literary creation here, and with pretty serious purposes, I think.
Sorry, Chris. Yeah.
I was just going to say, and contemporary theory and literature suggests that even stories can be persuasive. That they can be, they have a powerful effect of changing one's mind.
They
in
do.
the same way that maybe logic would, or not in the same way, but with the same result.
Well, I would like to say, for some of us, even more than, and it's not just even stories, I'd say it is stories. And I mean, if we look at our own political times, wherever people stand in regard to our political times, it's the stories that capture the imagination and the action, and sort of the more plain speech we use for our arguments, the less progress of unity happens in the nation. And so I want to say that maybe the whole scientific project applied to literature is helpful only to a degree, but that literature itself has a life. And that's why we can talk about the Bible as the living word, because it is alive with searches for meaning and with suggestions and evocative things. And even the gaps, I think was Elaine in that beautiful presentation last week, I think she was you two were talking about the gaps. Am I right? About gaps? Yeah. I mean, I think about the common saying about literature, show, don't tell. And the book of Ruth does that. It shows you the difficulties people are in without giving us the answers to these questions that I have. But I think that's its power, because it invites us in as if it were our own story. And that's why stories to me can work, but they have to be the right stories, of course, and well-formed stories. So.
And one of those, it occurs to me that one of those kind of tantalizing gaps in the story is that there's not a lot of like ethical comment on what happens or what's supposed to happen. The narrator just kind of goes. It's kind of like Genesis in that way. Like the narrator doesn't often say this character's bad, this character's good. But like when and the other thing too about the kind of the background of kind of the laws of ancient Israel, or the way that ancient Israel was supposed to protect orphans and widows, and protect vulnerable people, and to provide food for them. These kind of laws about gleaning you could find in Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so on. But there's this tension, like, did they ever do those things, or was this actually enforced? And so you get this kind of like ethical background that's kind of assumed about these laws, but also this kind of hesitation to say that they should do any of these things, or that these things were actually practiced, and so on. So there's this kind of and it makes me think about, our own world today. There's a lot of things that we assume we're supposed to be, we're supposed to help people and so on, but how do we actually do these things? And do we live up to the standards that we actually say we should live up to, and so on? I was reading this and it got me to think about, the way that our laws sometimes exist, but aren't enforced well or properly or fairly across different populations. And and it seems like in Ruth, this is kind of like a test case in a way. Are we who we think we are?
Interesting.
I don't know. But Chris, you mentioned the connections to James.
Say more about that. How does Ruth do that?
So, like, it seems to me like the way we talked about this with James, the book of James, last time. And Chris pointed this out in a note before the show. So I don't want to steal this from Chris. I'm sorry, Chris. But Chris said, hey, there's a connection here to James, which goes on about orphans and widows, and how we should care for them, and just kind of assumes that, pure religion, says James, is to care for the orphan and the widow and the poor. So this idea that it's kind of baked into ancient Israelite ideas of the covenant, that the wandering stranger, you're supposed to take care of these people, the poor and the orphan and the widow, that people who are vulnerable should be especially looked after, and Yahweh hears their cries, especially the cry of the enslaved Hebrew people. Yahweh hears, and the cry of Abel's blood from the ground, the cry of the people who've been oppressed, and so on. This seems to be kind of like a basic idea about ancient Israelite kind of law and society and religion and so on. But here, we see in stories throughout the Bible that, like, often it doesn't get enforced. It doesn't get applied in the ways that, and there's fights about that. And Judges seems to be a time when there's a big struggle about who are we and how do we constitute ourselves as a nation. The whole book. But then, what are our ethics? What does a human life mean? Whose life matters seems to be a question of the book of Judges. And so with Ruth, it's like a test case story. Do we actually help orphans and widows in real life, or in these real life, but in this narrative case, right? This actual lived experience that's being narrated. Would we take care of a foreign wandering widow who needs food, and an elderly woman who returns with this foreign woman bringing her in tow? Would we provide for them with gleaning? Would we keep them safe? These kind of basic expectations that seem to be always on edge of not happening in the book of Ruth, right? They may not be able to glean. They may be harassed in the fields. They may not, this law of kinship and redeemer may not actually be exercised. People have to kind of talk about it and argue about whether or not they're going to help their distant relatives. I don't know. It just seems like we're at this time, and I think in American society, where there's a lot of questions about what do we actually believe? What do we actually think? Do these values that we claim to uphold, do we uphold them, and how so? Anyway, that's just something that was on my mind. But
thank you. I mean, I certainly think as a nation right now, the USA is having a similar argument. I mean, I think that's part of the bread and butter of the day, the political undercurrent. Who do we help? Do we let in immigrants? Do we feed them? Do we give anybody health care? The whole gamut of care in a society. And so, when we claim to be Christian nation or Jewish Christian nation, Judeo-Christian, with this as our root set of values, more or less, do they appear in our laws, and who decides? Those are the questions then. So another
do we have a Ruth set of values? Yeah. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
Well, so another way to think about this book too is about the courage and stamina of Ruth a week after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death. That here Ruth Bader Ginsburg seems to have been very well named. That she has the name of this character who actually becomes so imaginative and resourceful and a go-getter and gets things done, not in the first chapter, except by clinging to her mother-in-law.
Yeah. And also, I have learned, in different things I've picked up from Ruth Bader Ginsburg throughout the years, but that her Jewish faith is what she cites as the reason that she cares for people who might be displaced by the law or might not be protected by the law. And she used to wear, one of her, beautiful kind of knitted pieces that she would wear on her judge's robes had the letters. yeah, tzedek, right? It had like
Right.
righteousness like sewed into it, which I found to be really beautiful. And,
righteousness or justice. Yes.
yeah. So in any event, yeah.
So
but yeah,
I want to raise just if we can sort of we've sort of talked a lot about chapter 1 generally, but I have a couple of specific questions. One that I saw in the chat on Facebook, and it's the language that Ruth uses for God, and if there's any significant for when the tetragrammaton is used, what we would see as the Lord with small caps in many of our English translations, versus when God is referred to as Almighty or Shaddai, or what is there significance, do you all think, to these changes in names, and what do we do with some of these declarations about like God's role in bringing about both the famine, the relief from famine, and all of the things that have happened poorly in Naomi's life. So some of the sort of explicit theological engagement that we see in this first chapter.
And just to nuance that question a little bit, Kathleen, too, the idea that in verse 6, the narrator says that the Lord had considered the people and given them food. Right. That's one of the few times that the people talk in this story talk about God a lot and attribute actions to God or interpret things through God's action, but the narrator rarely does, which is a bit unusual.
Right there, I think, yeah.
Yeah, in Hebrew literature. So,
you have an answer to that, Brennan.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know really, but
I don't have a clue really, except when she calls, let's see, Naomi talks about the Almighty. That's language, that's ancient language that shows up in poetry a lot in the Old Testament, and it means God the Almighty. Some think it comes from the word for breasts. So God, like the God of the mountain, like breasts. They think God of the mountains that look like breasts in the ancient in Israel. But who knows? It's sort of, to me, that language helps to distinguish the poetry or these special set in pieces. First, Ruth's, which begins in verse 16 and goes through 17, and then Naomi in verse 20 through 21. What happens a lot in Genesis, I don't know if it's going on here, but when the text moves into poetry, it draws your attention. It interprets some of what's going on, and it just seems to me to be somehow the point of one of the points of the passage. So here you have Ruth. Well, let's do the harder and more fun question about Naomi earlier that you mentioned. Where did you say? Where is that verse where God has done these terrible things to me? Where is that? Oh, it's in verse 20.
Verse 20. Yeah.
Verse 20. I think my own thought about that relates back to my Genesis work. Here I am with my hammer again. And one of the things that happens to people who have experienced personal catastrophe or corporate collective catastrophe is that they need to understand how and why it happened. And all the prophetic books are doing that. Lamentations tries to do that. This book also starts to do it. And people have to have an explanation for their suffering, even if they're wrong. They just psychologically need cause and effect to still be in place. So when Naomi describes all the loss and how bitter her life has been, it's God has done it. God has dealt bitterly with me. So God's not gone. God's still there. There's no hope, no chance here of atheism. It doesn't happen in the ancient world. There is instead that God has done something to me. God has turned against me. And so it's one explanation among many in the literature of the exilic and post-exilic period.
Yeah.
For what? Sometimes it's the people blaming themselves or the prophets blaming the people. You're getting punished. She doesn't say that. She doesn't accept a language of being punished by God. She just thinks the way her life is turning out is that God is clearly the one behind it. Now, I don't myself subscribe to that theology at all, but I understand it as a strategy to survive.
Right.
And so that's what I think she's doing here.
Yeah.
And then she turns out to be, she's not wrong about her life, but it turns out that God is involved in this story in ways she has no imagination to think about.
Yeah.
And that's what I think my life is like too, frankly. But
and hopefully, like, the story's trying to give that in a way to people who might feel like their futures are hemmed in or determined, you know, like the Persian period. And it seems like the work of the prophets too, like third Isaiah, to try to help people to think more expansively about their lives and God's possibilities and so on, from a space of fear and rightly so, you know, fear of being hurt by others, but to kind of transform that into an openness, it seems to be what God's up to in the Persian period, it seems to me.
Yeah, precisely so. But so then I think, thank you, Chris, for bringing us back to this. So of course, maybe some of your listeners know about the hymn from the Weston Monastery of many years ago that is Ruth's song, "Wherever you go, I will go, and there I'll be buried beside you." Here, that is taken directly from here, and it's clearly her, this foreign woman from the enemies, who is publicly making an oath of fidelity to her mother-in-law, almost like a marriage. The GLBTQ plus community has often seen a very valuable piece here of same-sex love, but there's no sense here that it's sexual, but there is absolutely a sense of clinging in covenants, in a covenant sense. It's like, and so it's so total. This person who might be bringing in false gods, this person who is an enemy, this person who is unreliable, is saying, I'm not going to go back. Wherever you live, I'm going to live. Your people will be my people. I'm not a Moabitess anymore. Your God will be my God. And I'm going to stick with you, and may God curse me if I don't. May God do thus and so to me. Even if death, if even death parts me from you. So if they worried about this stranger, this poetic hymn declares, hey, I'm in for this. I'm in for the long term. Here I am. And if you think bad things about foreign women, I'm not one of them. I'm not one of those bad foreign women. I'm me. I'm a good person. Foreign women are good. Yeah. I think it's saying that.
Yeah, well, one of the readings that we that is amazing. Yeah, one of the readings we we suggest some like secondary readings for folks if they want to read further. And one of those articles was by Mark Smith, and it really builds on the work of Tikva Frymer-Kensky. But I think it was just kind of blew my mind when I read this a while ago. And he points out the connections between Ruth's particular language, like your people are my people, your God is my God, and so on, and comparing it to some of the covenantal language we see other places in the Bible. And Tikva Frymer-Kensky is the first person to do this, but Mark Smith kind of fleshes it out a bit. But in verse 4 of 1 Kings 22, there's two kings talking, and one king says, will you go with me to battle? And the other king replies, I am as you are. My people are your people. My horses are your horses. What I loved about Mark Smith's article is he said that a lot of people imagine that this is the language of diplomacy that Ruth is kind of using for family life here. But instead, Mark turns it on its head and says, no, actually, this is the language of family making. And that has been applied, that gets turned into the language of diplomacy, or like, the generals are borrowing the language of families. And so what he's, saying is that she is creating a family. And there's a question, are Ruth and Naomi even related technically after the death of the men who kind of were the blood connections between them? But so here, Ruth seems to be fabricating a family out of thin air that consists only of two vulnerable women with no men in the picture.
Beautiful.
Right. And so just this kind of like creative act of using this covenantal language. And then that, like, that to me, it kind of relates to that use of the covenantal word, which often gets translated as like kindness, which I think is just such a bad translation, but chesed,
Yeah,
which to me is such this strong word. I don't know where you come down in this kind of debate, Kathleen, but for me, like when I read my Episcopalian version of the Psalms and it says, loving kindness for chesed, I just think like it makes me feel like, oh, I'm going to make you some cupcakes and then, loving
Right.
kindness,
Beautiful.
but it's this kind of like word of covenant loyalty, fierce covenant loyalty that Ruth is talking about, right? I mean, I don't know where you come down on all that, but
well, what I think about hesed is it's one of those words that has so many layers of meaning. You can almost pick what you want, but I think it is a fierce commitment in a covenant to other people, other persons, and I think that this is a fierce declaration by Ruth. So I agree with you, and I think loving kindness, well, itself is a cliche in our society, but if you really are loving and kind, maybe it isn't. So it's that our language maybe has squelched the energy of the word hesed, the strength of that word.
That's a good point, because being loving kindness, possessing the quality of loving kindness shouldn't be some kind of mealy mouth thing to say, right?
Right.
And this word is I know there's depth of meaning and all of that, but it's one of the things that's super important is that it's often associated with God. Like this is how God is regarded as dealing with the people of God. It's frequently with, it's like it's almost in the DNA of God's character that God is this way, and that then when humans are called to be this way, this is one of those places where we are imitating God. We're imitating the divine. And that even in verse 8 of Ruth, chapter 1, may the Lord deal kindly with you. This is, may the Lord show this sort of fierce covenant commitment to you.
Right. Yes.
And then Ruth seems to be the one who's showing that fierce covenant commitment to Naomi.
Yes. Excellent. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Well, and then of course, I guess we should probably, because we're running out of time, we should probably talk about her again, about her Naomi's sadness.
Yes.
I guess we said it already. Oh,
I mean, she talks about her sadness, but then also this fullness and emptiness comes back, which we've seen as a theme. But in verse 21, the fullness and emptiness. What do you take that to be?
Well, of course, for Naomi, for a woman, a mother of two sons and a husband, that was her fullness. That would be the way women identified themselves in the past in ancient Israel. Their whole being, more or less, was being mother, wife, and that's how they had honor and security and rest in society. And she doesn't have that anymore. So and she may be really poor because they are obviously pretty poor, because they're going to her daughter-in-law becomes a migrant worker here when in the next chapter, I think it comes, when she meets Boaz.
Yeah.
So that's one of the themes. Well, the other thing I think about with regard to Ruth 1 is that it's the reversal of the book of Job. And it's the literary pattern where, Job, everything starts out absolutely perfectly. So, if you're going to keep reading, it's going to go downhill. And then it goes up again. This is the reverse of that. This is starting out in trouble. And happily, the trouble sort of starts to turn. The emptiness starts to become fullness in the very next chapter. And the other thing is, of course, it's the barley harvest. And so it is already a blossoming. And that blossoming is a literary blossoming. It's the blossoming of life that will happen to Naomi, and of course for Ruth, and for the whole nation. So there's something so positive about starting in the bottom and going up, nowhere else to go. And so it's the time of harvest. And why barley, I don't know, but it's good food. It makes good soup and good stew. So
hearty
survival. Yes. survive.
And so it's in Bethlehem too. Like it's in this house of bread.
House of bread, barley bread
starts
yes.
to come. Yeah, right at the very end of that. Right. Yeah. So that idea is like there's this hint that things are going to get better, but also the hint that like things might be difficult when they come into town and the women start to ask, is this Naomi? Like, does she look bad?
Yes.
You know, is she like in a destitute situation, whereas she had, you know, last time they saw her, she was doing fine, or, you know, now she's bringing this foreign woman in, all those different gaps that we could fill in different ways about why people might be upset or trying to help her. It's kind of hard to know, but
yeah, you don't know. It's show don't tell. But that Naomi looks terrible is utterly predictable to people who've experienced loss, great loss, catastrophe, calamity, and so that she's not recognizable is a realistic touch in the storytelling, I think.
Yeah, and that was one of the other articles that we sort of floated for people was by Uni Lee, and it talked a lot about how identity is constructed in the book of Ruth and how it's much more fluid, and here even, you know, is this Naomi is really a question of identity. Where she left, her identity would have been tied to her husband, maybe her sons, and she comes back, and there is a vital question: is this Naomi? Because Naomi would have been known by those male counterparts, and so you know, there's almost an openness. And when you ask the question about the barley harvest, I thought, oh, this is foreshadowing a new reaping. There's a harvest coming, and a new sense of fullness is going to come, and Naomi is going to be recreated. Ruth is going to be recreated in the chapters that follow.
Right. So, and just to say that the barley harvest, that's the feast Shavuot, but the feast that Christians associate with the name Pentecost. But in the Jewish tradition, this is the giving of the law is the kind of center of this celebration. Right. So Ruth is read on that celebration each year in the synagogues, but also Ruth is here kind of like there's a lot of like Torah in the background, right? These laws that are there to preserve the lives of vulnerable people, wandering people, the gleaning and so on. So it seems to me like there's this kind of the barley harvest may suggest something about like, oh yeah, Moses said we should help people, right? You know, they could, because there's all these like kind of references to Leviticus and but especially Deuteronomy throughout, and the idea that there's supposed to be some sort of preservation of vulnerable people with the resources of the community. But anyway, that might be out there somewhere, or might be totally
the other thing is they need the harvest because she's got to go get a job and meet Boaz. So the setup, it's a setup for the next chapter, and then
Kathleen, that's a
romance. I mean, that's the question: is the book a romance or not? But never mind. Is that even a category for reading it?
That's a good question.
And you've set us up nicely, Kathleen, for sort of wrapping up our study for today of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is where we do meet Boaz, and we begin to see some more dynamics in the story. And next week we will be joined by Roger Nam, who is now at Emory University, was at Portland Seminary before that, on the Best Coast.
George Fox, yeah.
Say what?
He was at George Fox. Yeah.
George Fox. Oh, he wasn't at the seminary.
Well, I think he might have been in the seminary. Is it called Portland Seminary, part of George Fox?
Yeah, they did a name change a couple years ago, rebranded. But yes, anyways, he's now a professor at Emory University and Candler School of Theology, and we are honored to be joined by him for our discussion. Good. And Kathleen, thank you so much. Somebody in Facebook said, Kathleen is such a great storyteller and humorist. So grateful for her presence today. And I couldn't say it better myself. Brennan probably could. But we're grateful for you being with us, and grateful for those of you who either joined us on Zoom or on Facebook Live.
Thank you so much. My honor. It's an honor. A blast.
It is our honor, Kathleen, and I am so grateful for the time that you've provided us with here, and for helping us to read and think. You were always such a lively conversationalist, but also teacher, and I am so sad that the students at Columbia Seminary get me instead of you now. So apologies to everyone in the world. But anyway, Kathleen, thank you so much.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.